Good morning, everyone. My name is Guri Skedsmo. I come from the University of Oslo in Norway, and I also work at Schwyz University Teacher Education in Switzerland. And I've been fortunate to follow this project from the very beginning, and as an associated partner. And I have with great interest followed the PhDs coming out of this project. Until now, 4 PhDs and 3 in the making. So I think this is a very great outcome of this project. This morning we will hear about insights and findings from this reformed project. We will have 4 presentations, so this will be like a medley. Antoni Vircher, Professor of Sociology at Autonomous University of Barcelona, he will start with providing some framework for us for the project. Then Clara Fontevilla, she will continue. She's a postdoc at the University of Glasgow and Autonomous University of Barcelona, and she will present a snapshot findings from the project. The same will Marcel Paget do. He is a postdoc at the University of Girona. And finally, we will have Gerard Ferrer Esteban, who will also present findings, and he is a lecturer at University of Berta Catalona. The floor is yours, Antoni.
Thank you, Guri, and good morning, everyone. Context is one of the most used concepts in comparative and international education, since it's usually assumed that is a key mediating factor to understand very different phenomena. However, as Gita Steiner-Kamsky was saying yesterday, paradoxically, the concept of context is often undefined and under-theorized in our field. So context is conceived as a matter of fact, as a background factor of something that is something more relevant, that is our study object. However, as we argue in this presentation, context is not so easily separable from our main research objects, and we need to bring it to the forefront as a primary focus of our research. The Reformed project is a multi-country and multi-scalar research project that has obliged us to take context seriously as an analytical device. And the main objective of this plenary session is to share with you how we have conceptualized and theorized context within the different research strands of the project, what are some of the lessons learned, and related findings in the form of snapshots. The aim of the Reform project, or the general goal, is to analyze contemporary changes in school assessment and accountability in an era in which schools increasingly operate as autonomous administrative units that need to deal with different sources of competitive pressures coming from their environment. We have labeled this reform model as SAGWA, a school autonomy with accountability, and we give a lot of importance to the with, because the program ontology of SAGWA says that if we want schools to be more accountable and responsible according to their results, they need to be more autonomous, and vice versa, if governments will only give more autonomy to schools if the latter accept being subject to new and stricter forms of external control. So the main idea of the project is to analyze how new governance instruments that configure the SAGWA package has been disseminated, recontextualized, and enacted at different levels, including agenda setting, regulation, and practice, and with what effects in terms of teachers' work, educational practice, and the structuration of educational systems. So the presentation will follow this structure. So I will start talking a bit about the global status of the SAGWA agenda. Then I will try to unpack context in comparative education policy analysis, and my colleagues will continue by giving some of these resources in terms of different lines of inquiry and research strands. So, on the global status of the SAWA agenda, we conceive SAWA as a global reform model, and in a way is a package that assembles different policy instruments, including learning standards, accountability mechanisms, school autonomy, and national assessments. National assessments are a key instrument in bringing together this agenda, in the sense that national assessments allow to hold autonomous schools accountable against the achievement of centrally defined learning standards. And as you can see in these figures, to which also Gita Steinerkamp, she was referring yesterday, there has been an increase in the adoption of national large-scale assessments in the OECD context. So we can say that almost all countries in the OECD policy field have adopted national large-scale assessments, but the number of national large-scale assessments adoption is still increasing because basically there are countries adopting more than one. And also, as we can see in the figure, the nature of these national large-scale assessments being adopted in the last 20 years has a census-based approach, which is the necessary type of instrument to hold school actors accountable. So we are still in this explosive phase of adoption. And I would like to give you some theoretical but also empirical input on why this is happening, why is SAWA gaining so much presence in educational policy debates and educational systems. At a more international level, what we observe is that SAWA provides global institutions, but also national governments, with new reform ideas and discourse in an era in which the privatization agenda seems to be exhausted, at least at the discursive level. So SAWA advances a post-bureaucratic governance approach that is not incompatible, but offers an alternative to the pro-market agenda of privatization, school competition, and choice that became hegemonic in the 90s in the context of the World Bank, the OECD. But this is an agenda that faced lots of opposition and generated important equity tensions. So in a way, SAWA doesn't break with the paradigm of privatization, but offers some continuity. The second point is that SAWA aligns with the effectiveness and learning shift that contemporary educational reform has gone through in the last 2 decades due to broader trends in public sector reform, having new public management as the main policy paradigm, the educational race impinged by ILSAs and in particular by PISA since the year 2000, and the construction and acceptation of learning as the main proxy of educational quality. Okay, the SAWA agenda is also politically convenient and semiotically malleable. Why we say that is politically convenient? Because makes governments looks concerned with educational quality, inequalities, and learning gaps in front of public opinion, at the same time that they place responsibility for educational improvement in teachers and schools. It's also convenient because it implies reforming education through instrument change instead of changing broader goals that is also more politically charged and more controversial. So the SAWA agenda is apparently more technical, and this facilitates policy adoption and retention. We say that it's also semiotically malleable, and this is also a condition for adoption, at least at an international scale. And here it's important to say that against some simplistic views of SAWA being a managerial agenda or a direct transposition of new public management principles to education, what we observe instead is a lot of bricolage work between the fields of pedagogy and management when the SAWA agenda is instrumentalized at the country context. So the SAWA agenda is based on principles such as transparency, autonomy, and accountability that different groups, for different reasons, consider as desirable. So accordingly, we find this bipartisan support to which we were referring yesterday, and the construction of some coalitions that are pushing for the same agenda, although they do that for different reasons. But these coalitions contribute to this policy desirability and and continuity. Also based on the work of, and here is the fourth point, based on the work of Vos and Simons, to which Patrick was referring yesterday, we find that at the moment of policy adoption, these new governance instruments are legitimated because of their functional or instrumental promises, like effectiveness, achievement, reduction of learning gaps, the promotion of more relevant education, and so on. But with the passage of time, we tend to forget about these functional premises, and we are retaining these instruments because of their structural promises and effects. In a way, this type of policy instruments generate a new mode of governance, new roles and positions in the educational system, the creation of new experts, and also economic interest. As Christian Marois explains, one of the reasons why the SAGO agenda has this structural impact is because these instruments acquire symbolic power. They produce specific representations for interpreting the empirical world. They define what is quality education, school improvement, and so on and so forth. And finally, I would like to say that the SAGO agenda has not been exempt from criticism, but has had a very important evolving and mutating capacity, which explains its survival as a reform model in the last 20 years. So if we look at the OECD discourse, in the beginning when they started conceptualizing SAGO, they were thinking about a short menu of a school autonomy with accountability, with school rankings, individual rewards, high-stake assessments, and a school-based management. But now this agenda has evolved towards a more Christmas tree agenda where different types of assessments are combined, different types of logics between incentivist logics. Assessments are not only summative, but also formative. They include self-evaluation, as Jaco Kauko was saying yesterday. Evaluation calls more evaluation. Interestingly, this evolves in parallel to broader transitions from new public management to new public governance in public sector reform discourse. And we believe that one of the reasons why this SAGO agenda has had continuity is also using the discourse or the work of Vos, because it has been able to create in many contexts a very powerful instrument constituency. So there is an education testing industry, publishers, consultants, experts on school improvement that support this policy continuity. They are actors that constantly look for new uses and new problems for these instruments and nurture them with their own demand. So this explains in a way what Patrick was saying yesterday about how new governance instruments acquire a life of their own, and it's basically because of these new policy constituencies that they generate beyond the policy field or the formal government field. Okay, so because of these global factors, we see that SAGO has acquired this international status, at least in the OECD context, and has survived to different critiques and cycles of feedback loops. And to many scholars, these factors would be seen as a driver of institutional isomorphism and convergence. But next, we explain how taking context seriously can help us to better understand how the evolution of the SAGO agenda is a story of variation and differentiation, and not necessarily of convergence and isomorphism. I will start talking about administrative tradition as a very important contextual factor. And in a way, public administration is probably the most important institution in mediating external reform pressures, especially for governance reforms. At the same time, is one of the most omitted variables in comparative education, and this is unfortunate for different reasons. First, because when we look at different families of administrative traditions, this is a categorization based on the work of Guy Peters, we see that countries' administrations, public administrations, are different according to very important variables and characteristics that are key, especially when it comes to understand the retention and implementation of new governance instruments. At the same time, research on SAWA reforms have been mainly conducted in a very particular administrative context, which is that of what we call the Anglo-American administrative tradition, or NPM marketizers, because we like to include Chile in this category. So most of the research on the effects of performance-based accountability on teachers' work have been conducted in this particular context. And of course, this means that we cannot extrapolate conclusions of the effects of these policies on the basis of existing research to other contexts, because we believe that there are some particularities that need to be taken into account. So Peters himself makes a compelling case for the study of the administrative tradition. He considers that the bureaucratic apparatus is not only simply implementing programs, but is also a key locus of policy making, a source of political advice, and shapes policy choices and the implementation of policies. Similarly, Pollitt and Buchard consider that the political administrative institutions operate as the topography over which reformers must travel, and accordingly shape the form, speed, and content of reform. So the main assumption within this line of work is that administrative regimes or traditions will intervene strategically in the reception of external reform pressures and strongly conditions the chances of reform models such as SAWA being retained, adapted, and enacted in both regulatory frameworks and systems of practice. So administrative regimes vary in how compatible they are with the selection of certain public sector reforms, but also in how effective these systems are in implementing these reforms once adopted. So if we look at three of the categories that we have in our country sample, we see that they are very different in how compatible they are in relation to the SAWA agenda. So in the NPM marketizers, Anglo-American traditions, we see that there is a deep audit culture with a long tradition of focus on performance. The differentiation in public services and the client orientation of these services is widely accepted. So the SAWA agenda is highly compatible with this particular tradition. In contrast, in the Napoleonic countries that predominate in the south of Europe, also in France, we see that there is now this audit culture, and implementation is understood as rule compliance and ex-ante controls. And there is a conception of public services and civil servants working in public services as a uniform body, and differentiation is not so much accepted. So here we see this low compatibility with the SAWA agenda at the level of public administration. And the Nordic model is an interesting case, very intermediate, in the sense that there is a greater orientation toward results, but a rejection of the market dynamics and the market mechanisms. They are also more open to diversification, but not because they are client-driven, but more citizen-oriented since the municipalization reforms of the 90s in many of these countries. So we see that here the compatibility is between intermediate and high. So we don't mean that administrative traditions are static by far, but path-dependent institutions with inertias that inevitably affect education policy dynamics. And we don't only want to mean that this is the only type of context that matters, because we also believe that specific education institutions and how they are regulated in different countries also matter, which brings me to the next slide. Basically here we want to say, and this is a topic that Marcel will cover more in depth, that new policy instruments are usually assembled with previous instruments in place. And here we find again that in different contexts and in different particular countries that we cover in the project, there are different accountability traditions, different forms of calibration of PBA, and also different types of teachers' autonomy regulations that inevitably will affect how these policies are received and implemented. For instance, in a country like Chile, we have this alignment with the performance-based accountability idea, a thick mode of PBA with high stakes. And the autonomy of teachers is usually restricted by school management, in comparison at least to the other country contexts where we do research. For instance, in the case of Catalonia and Spain, the accountability tradition where PBA lands has a more bureaucratic approach. The PBA modality is thin and low stakes, and teachers tend to enjoy high levels of autonomy, but because of de facto reasons, not by design, in the sense that this autonomy is high because accountability is, let's say, thin. And then in the Nordic context, and specifically in Norway, where we have been developing some work, we find a form of accountability that is more based on peer review, professionalism, and horizontal control. PBA accountability is thick, but is usually low stakes or reflexive, as we also like to call it. And the level of autonomy is high, but in this case by design, because there is a lot of trust in teachers on behalf of governmental institutions. And autonomy is not only individual or collegial, it's also institutional, in the sense that teachers have their representative bodies that have their own voice in policy-making processes, which is something that we don't see so clearly in the other country contexts. To finish with our different conceptualizations, okay, I would like to say also something about something very important about how PBA is landing in different policy contexts. And it's not only about teacher regulations and previous forms of accountability, it's also about market regulations. So the SAGWA agenda can land in contexts that regulate and control market forces in education in a very different way. PBA is a form of market competition in itself, if you want, in the sense that it's promoting competition among schools to remain legitimate and avoid being reformed, as Madsen says. But this form of administrative competition and pressure interacts in complex ways and in different ways with pressures coming from the market. And in some contexts, this interaction generates a sort of double pressure over the schools, as Alejandra Falabella likes to say. So again, in Chile is where we have these market forces more unleashed, and we expect that a policy like, for instance, a school ranking will generate more performance pressure than in a context like Norway, where there is a restricted school choice policy and a very low presence of private sector provision. And this is my last slide. That is what we call a school context, or many scholars in policy sociology call a school context, which is a very accepted type of variable when we want to understand policy enactment, at least from a more critical policy sociology perspective. So we conceive a school context as a multidimensional construct. This is the typical way how Stephen Ball likes to define context, which we really like because it covers different aspects that might affect the process of enactment. So here, the main idea is that a school context, together with teachers' beliefs, are key to understand how teachers make sense of and interpret a policy mandate. But in the Reformed project, we like to see how a school context not only interacts with these, let's say, semiotic variables, but also in relation to what I just said, we think that it's important to see how ideas, beliefs interact together with the perceived pressure by schools and teachers when it comes to understand the dispositions towards enactment and the final practices. So Gerard Ferrer will explain a bit more about how we see this modification in enactment theory, because we believe that strongly that implementation and enactment is not only about a matter of interpretation and beliefs, but also you can have different beliefs and interpretation, but you will behave according to whether you feel more or less pressure by the policy mandate. With this, I would like to give the word to Clara Fondevila.
Okay, many thanks, Tony. So, yeah, as Tony was commenting, what I will try to do next is to illustrate the mediating role of this particular layer of context and administrative regimes, and I will do so by showcasing some of the findings of our research that we think that speak to such themes. So, first of all, a few words about why we think that there is potential in there is explanatory power in the case of administrative regimes. The thing is that when you look at literature on traveling or globalizing policies that disseminate globally, typically there is an implicit and sometimes explicit assumption that there is some degree of isomorphism, that countries are becoming more alike, as Tony was commenting. And sometimes this is very specific in the case of a particular stream of the literature that revolves around the idea of convergence. This is a very explicit hypothesis, and there is some truth in this, but there are also some limitations, and we observe that typically most of the literature on convergence focus on a very particular moment of the policy process, the policy adoption, the first moment, and in a particular materialization of policy, which is the policy text, the more explicit decree or act or law, whatever. So in a way, there is less clarity if there is convergence in the enactment, in the implementation of these policies. And we also observe that precisely as a consequence of this emphasis on the policy adoption moment, the emphasis is put on the political variables explaining this convergence or even potential divergence. What do we mean by this? That because the focus is on the very first moment in which the debate and the policy is articulated, it makes sense that political factors have a lot of explanatory power, but when it comes to the enactment and the implementation, it is important, we think and we claim, to take into account other layers of reality, such as administrative regimes. And in general, what we think is that this globalization, expansion of autonomy and accountability policies, or SAWA, are a good opportunity to unpack this convergence thesis and better understand the role of administrative regimes in explaining this. So basically, we will illustrate such claim by focusing on two different moments of the policy process that we think that are interesting. First, the moment of policy instrumentation understood as something else, that the first moment of policy adoption and policy formulation, and including the evolution, the progressive calibration or adjustment of these policies. And we will do so on the basis of a research paper informed by systematic literature review with around, I believe, 150-something papers covering a wide range of OECD, basically, countries. And then we will move to the moment of the policy enactment on the basis of a paper informed by a convergence analysis. We can give further details on this in the Q&A session, maybe, but basically, to give you an idea, we were relying on PISA data, so again, OECD or OECD adjacent countries, different waves from 2000 to 2018, and a combination of a more inductively informed analysis and a more deductive approach. But yeah, we can talk more about this if anyone is interested. So starting with the moment of instrumentation, what we saw here is that precisely, it's true that in the first moment of the adoption, political factors and other reasons explain a lot, but what is interesting is that in the evolution of the accountability and school autonomy frameworks adopted by different countries, administrative regimes and institutional legacies in general play a determinant role. This, I think, is very well illustrated by the fact that we identified these different groups of countries, and first we see that NPN marketizers, this category that includes Anglo-American countries but also Chile, they originally adopted SOA reforms with market policy objective, but what is interesting is that with the passage of time, and precisely as a result of this compatibility that Tony was commenting between NPM and this administrative tradition, despite the problems that are aroused as a consequence of these frameworks, the solution has been making them more sophisticated and an intensification of the stakes and the consequences associated to the accountability frameworks. A very different picture emerged when we look at the Nordic Neo-Bavarian states, which include a combination of Nordic and Germanic countries. In this particular case, here we see that accountability and school autonomy policies are adopted as part of a quality agenda in a context of high levels of decentralization. But again, what is interesting is that with the passage of time, there is a certain deceleration or calibration of the SAWA model, in the sense that a specific features or elements of this model are finally removed. And this is particularly the case of the market-related components of the SAWA model. We see that in these countries, as a consequence of the action, feedback, resistance of different actors, the model is adjusted with the passage of time. And finally, different story is the case of Napoleonic states. Here, says accountability is adopted as part of the modernization agenda and so on. But what is interesting is that as part of this difficult compatibility between the Napoleonic administrative regime and the NPM agenda, the implementation and enactment of SAWA has been characterized by a lot of discontinuities, a lot of back and forth, and basically the, let's say, fluctuation or the ebb and flow of this approach is crucially determined by the different political forces in power. So, and now moving to the next moment, the policy enactment part. Here, what we see is that if we look at different, let's say, manifestations of the SAWA agenda, both the convergence is different. I will give a bit more of detail on this. So to start with, if we pay attention to the School Autonomy Index in staff management, which in a way is a proxy for managerial accountability, so as captured by the figure on the left, the school-based management practice in terms of human resources varies greatly depending on administrative regimes, and what we see is that where this practice is the most widespread is in the NPM marketizers, so Chile and the Anglo-American countries, and to a lesser extent, Nordic countries with a Neo-Bavarian tradition. Whereas in the rest of regimes, and Napoleonic, Germanic, Confucian, autonomy in staffing is much more limited and does not show obvious signs of growth. And in terms of convergence, this idea of are countries becoming more alike, less alike, or what is happening, what we see is that, as you can see maybe in the picture, in the figures in your right, is that our analysis reveals that the Nordic countries show a certain trends toward convergence, in the sense that the coefficient of variation, the axis, vertical axis, has tended to decrease over time, whereas Napoleonic countries have tended to diverge slightly, especially during the period 2000-2009. The rest of countries have not experienced much variation in terms of internal dispersion, as reflected by the fact that the lines are horizontal. So what is finally interesting here is to note that those country groups showing the lowest levels of internal dispersion correspond precisely to these administrative regimes in which the adoption of these policies is lower, so Confucian, Germanic, and Napoleonic regimes. So moving to another manifestation of the SAWA regime, what we see is that when it comes to whether a school's achievement data is publicly posted, what we see is that, as the figure on the left shows, again, NPM marketizers are the countries more likely to adopt this kind of policies. And it's worth noting the very limited spread of this practice within Germanic countries. But remarkably, again, not all these administrative regimes present the same level of internal homogeneity, as showed by the figures on the right. So we see that there are a few differences between countries classified as NPM marketizer. The coefficient of variation has tended to be very low. And Nordic, Confucian, and Napoleonic countries appear to constitute a much more heterogeneous group. And the case of Germanic countries, again, is interesting because they diverged during the period 2009 to 2012, a short period. The coefficient of variation rised, but they have been regaining a sense of convergence over the last years. And as a final example of different manifestations of the SAWA agenda and the convergence over time, what we see is that there are also important differences in the fact that whether schools are using In relation to the use of a standardized test to make judgments about teacher effectiveness, clear examples we would say of higher stakes accountability, and here Confucian countries stand out as the ones exhibiting the greatest use of a standardized test to make judgments about teachers. And these countries also interestingly show a significant trend of convergence over time. A second group of countries that is interesting and that make a significant use of this specific policy are NPM marketizers, but these countries do not show either convergence or divergence over time, basically because these are countries that have a long tradition of high stakes accountability, so the early moments of adopting this policy precedes PISA data and therefore our analysis. The rest of countries show a very limited use of test data to evaluate teaching work. Napoleonic countries have tended to become a bit more similar over time, whereas Nordic and Germanic countries experimented a process of convergence during a short period, 2000 to 2009, but their level of internal dispersion in general has remained quite high. And I will now give the floor to Marcel.
Okay, so now I will give you some insights about how the policy context mediate different trajectories, uses, and impacts of PBA in countries with different teachers' regulatory regimes. This presentation is based on the results of a forthcoming publication, which analyzed the impacts of PBA on teachers' autonomy. More specifically, this paper used the professional regulatory model as an analytical category to unveil the factors that mediate the effects of performance-based accountability on teachers' autonomy. In order to do so, we conducted a systematic literature review using this idea of the configurative approach, which is aimed to identify the different patterns of heterogeneity. Specifically, we applied the same syntax in Scopus and Web of Science, combined with hand searching in Google Scholar. In total, we have analyzed 101 research papers published between 2017 and 2020, and analytically we used these categories of the teacher regulatory models as the main analytical device to identify different patterns in order to understand the role of policy context as a modulator of performance-based accountability on teachers' autonomy. According to these regulatory models, we can classify the teacher regulatory models in four main models, which are the professional skill models, the market model, the rules models, and the training model. These models are quite equivalent to the administrative traditions that Clara explained, and I will focus in this presentation on the last three models, which are the market, the training, and the bureaucratic model. So, starting with the market model, this is the most paradigmatic and well-known case conformed basically by these new public management marketizers countries, which include the Anglo-American countries and Chile. Under this model, performance-based accountability have acquired an incremental dynamic. The uses, consequences, but also the metrics and the school grades impacted by accountability have expanded over time because initially the uses of the test were used at the school aggregate level, but now are increasingly applied to evaluate teachers and take important decisions on their work practices and the school organization. Such uses exerted an important performative pressures that generated important impacts over the autonomy, collegiality, and work control of teachers. The eager for performance in this context also generated unexpected effects, as testing has become a core tool to categorize students and develop ability grouping practices on the basis of these categories. In addition, most of the described impacts, such as triage teaching to the test, and curriculum narrowing appear to be affecting more directly the most disadvantaged students and schools. A broad range of studies also report that teachers feel that the way in which the curriculum is covered in these countries conflicts with test preparation and conflicts with some kind of more deep learning, the humanistic values, and more expressive forms of teaching. Other teachers also critique that the current emphasis on performance misrepresents students' learning and in fact is detrimental to this learning. According to such critical points of view, different forms of resistance are well documented in these countries, although the logics of consent, acceptation, and internalization of performance-based accountability are more frequently reported in the market model. Okay, then we have the training model, which is the second category and is the classical model associated to the Nordic countries. In these countries, performance-based accountability advanced through soft accountability policies predominantly based on quality assurance logics in a context where trust in teachers tend to prevail. In Nordic countries, the implementation of performance-based accountability was first received as a disruption of the welfare state model. However, policymakers, school actors, and professional organizations recontextualized and reappropriated the accountability approach, accommodating it to the Nordic administrative tradition. Accordingly, the standardized testing has been adopted in recent years for formative purposes and to facilitate more data use approaches. Performance metrics tend to focus on the school level, and the results of the national assessments imply low stakes for both schools and teachers, although increasing reputational stakes are also reported in the review. Then we have the So the teachers' perceptions and responses in this training model are dominated by a sort of ambivalent opinions and belief, and the more critical interpretations tends to be translated in covert forms of resistance. So in this context, we don't have or we don't find this more open resistance, and instead we see forms of covert resistance. In Nordic countries, the impacts of PBA, in fact, seem to be mitigated by the welfare state tradition, in the sense that in this model, an emphasis on equity in education and the trust in the teaching profession seems to attenuate the side effects of performance-based accountability. Finally, in this context, principals appear to be a key actor to protect and promote the collegial autonomy of teachers, which is alien in the Nordic model. Finally, we have the bureaucratic model, which is the one that prevails in countries with Napoleonic administrative traditions, including France, Spain, Italy, among others. And in this context, performance-based accountability adopted a low-stakes approach, and most of the schools tended to adopt the accountability policy instruments in a superficial and even in a ritualistic way. The policy trajectory of PBA in this context has been uneven and erratic, with back-and-forth dynamics, because of the persisting tension between the bureaucratic centralism and an increasing demand for more managerialism, more accountability, and this performance-oriented global agenda. The reception of accountability policy instruments in Napoleonic administrative traditions or in the teaching profession regulatory model dominated by the rule model tend to be complicated in this context, basically due to a very open resistance and opposition of school actors and teacher unions, because school actors tend to see accountability as a source of control and distrust in a context of de facto individual teacher autonomy. Interestingly, although the consequences attached to the test tend to be soft in these countries, similar impacts are found in Napoleonic administrative countries. Most notably teaching to the test, but also increased workloads or the erosion of teachers' autonomy. So, to close with my presentation, this is a very brief overview of the results provided. I don't want to spend time here because this is a table that is just a summary of the results, but I just want to highlight that the uses, impacts, and trajectories of performance-based accountability differs in each of the models analyzed according to the combination of administrative traditions and teacher regulatory regimes. Accordingly, the evidence reviewed suggests that policy context is an important contextual factor to take into account when analyzing how policy instruments evolve and are used in different countries. As main conclusions, we want to outline that teachers' professional autonomy is being challenged by the rise of accountability policies. However, the effects of performance-based accountability on teachers' autonomy vary across the world. The regulatory models of the teaching profession intervene, among other factors, in the variegated perceptions and effects of performance-based accountability among teachers, showing the critical role of institutional and policy factors to understand how performance-based accountability is lived, experienced, and recontextualized in different countries. So this is all on my side. I give the word to Gerard to talk about school context.
Good morning. So, yeah, Marcel pointed out how the effects of PBA systems on teacher practices vary across the globe. In my piece, I would like to show how such practices within the same regulatory frame, which is in this case Chile, are shaped by how PBA is perceived, lived, experienced, and recontextualized in the school context. So we are going to see variation within country. To do it, we analyze the school responses through theoretical cross-fertilization. So we integrate, in one hand, sense-making theory, how school actors interpret and make sense of policies, with institutional theories on organizational decoupling. So according to which, the higher the level of pressure the policies exert on school actors, the more school actors will adopt tactical responses, strategical responses to deal with such pressure. So let me go to the point, what did we find, the conclusions. First, I start from them. First, we found that schools don't respond to accountability regulations uniformly. So not in all circumstances, high stakes accountability systems operate as performativity devices. Instead, PBA regulations generate a range of different school responses, which we found go beyond the conventional classification, which usually focus on alignment versus decoupling, high versus low fidelity implementation, and so on. And last, we found how the subjective variables have a mediating role in the enactment of PBA. In particular, we see how the perceived pressure interacts with how school actors make sense of PBA regulations. How did we conduct this research? We followed a sequential mixed methods strategy. First, with a quantitative stage, with regression models with fixed effects. with data, using data from the reformed questionnaire survey. And then with a qualitative multiple case study through interviews with principals, with teachers, document analysis, and direct observation. Our two main indicators used as proxies of interpretation for interpretation of PBA and pressure from PBA regulations are PBA dispositions, which reflects whether PBA results are perceived as fair, are perceived as valid, and performative pressure, which is a combination of different variables of pressure to get good results. According to higher or lower levels of PBA disposition and different levels of pressure perceived, we got a chart in which all the schools are mapped. So here is the baseline. So, okay, let's go. Let's go to the let's go to the results of the quantitative analysis. The first result I would like to highlight is that pressure seems to be related to all responses, to all school practices analyzed, except one. I want to recall that all those are correlational evidence, so we are not talking about direct effects. We saw, on one hand, how performative pressure is related to the redistribution of resources to tested subjects, is related to making decisions, curricular decisions according to test content, is related to alignment with PBA standards or learning standards, is related to preparing students for the test, teaching to the test, and is also related to using data to build reputation, school reputation. It's not only related to the data used to assess teachers. That would be the more qualitative process of improvement in schools. And this happens when we hold PBA disposition constant, but also when there are decreasing levels of PBA dispositions. There is also a clear pattern regarding the PBA dispositions, and we found that the more school actors try to carry out tactical the more schools share a good disposition toward PBA, so the more they feel or they see that test results are valid, the more school actors try to carry out tactical responses to inflate the scores. In this case, this is observed with decreasing levels of pressure. And this asymmetrical relationship between PBA disposition and pressure is observed in the interaction terms we included between pressure and disposition. We have also interesting and relevant results according to the school composition, which is another variable that we can cross with the results and with performance of the schools, which indeed show heterogeneous association, but in this place we don't have time to share, but we will have the opportunity. So according to the combination of both indicators, which we showed relevant patterns in the models, we carried out the qualitative analysis, which allowed us to identify at least 5 school categories, according to both axes. First, we found first category when the pressure is high and the PBA dispositions are low, which have called fabricating better scores. And here we find mainly public schools with disadvantaged students that carry out practices of teaching to the test and align to learning standards only in those tested areas and subjects, but don't incorporate them in the pedagogical approach. Then we find the schools with low pressure, but also with low PBA disposition. And here we have identified two types of schools. First, delusion schools, we called delusion schools, which show resistance to adopt PBA regulations, are schools which are critical with the accountability system and don't feel pressure at all. Then we also have identified through the qualitative inquiry opting out schools, which are schools with a very complex composition, have no academic ambition, and are focused mainly on issues of security rather than academic performance. And they are characterized by a low level of responses or by no responses at all. And then we have what we call the induced alignment. Here we find schools that feel pressure, have PBA disposition, and we could say that they are enthusiastic supporters of the accountability regulations. We find schools then that invest effort to introduce PBA mandate to all the school approach, not just in the tested areas or subjects. Are schools mainly with middle-class families, with leadership styles more managerial, and are schools that are mainly focused on data use, having the learning outcomes as the main benchmark. And finally was that one. We have schools that easily accommodate to accountability regulations, are schools who believe in testing, believe in academic outcomes as a benchmark to carry out strategies at school level, but don't feel pressure. And that can be explained by the composition of the students and the privilege they have in the local market. They usually have a culture of continuous improvement to the extent that they don't feel pressure. We found schools mainly private, with, as I said, socially advantaged students, having the test preparation as a common practice, an integrated practice, and a high data use. So yeah, now this is all. So far we have showed the results from different levels of analysis of the project. We have also showed this mixed method approach with which we have addressed many research questions of the project. And of course now we would be pleased to hear you for any question or comment you may have. Thank you very much.
So, thank you very much for your interesting presentations. We now move on, and we have a bit more than 20 minutes for questions and comments. And we also have someone taking care of the online questions and comments if you also have something. Mm-hmm. Please, go ahead. Nini? And please state your name and where you come from.
My name is Nini Borgström. I'm from Lunds University in Sweden. But I'm not sure that the narrative about the Nordic countries is so relevant anymore. Unfortunately, I don't think you can count Sweden into the Nordic narrative as you I would like to that it has been in that way, but Norway and Finland is still in the neo-Weberian country, but I think that Sweden is more comparable to Chile. We have gone far away on the marketization, and we have big companies, unregulated school market, and even the OECD urged Sweden to regulate the school market. So I just wanted to comment on that. It would have been nice, but it's not the case, I think.
Any more questions, comments? I think we collect some questions and comments, and then we ask the panelists to respond. Gita?
Thank you so much for this amazing presentation. I especially also like the framing of and the bigger findings, and I think they will really impact other research that we are doing. Just a word on the typology and the titles, labels you use. Is there another way? Other labels, not comparing Confucius with Napoleon, and all of Africa is left out, Muslim countries are left out, Asian countries are left out. Do you have to even, do we need to have the ambition of covering the globe? No. No one tells us to cover the globe. We don't have to have this ambition. Same also, we don't need to have this ambition necessarily to always compare everything, all these matrices. It's enough to say that this type of government or governance structure is characterized by, or is typical for, it's like extreme case sampling or typical case sampling. You don't need to compare everything with everything, even at the school level. I think it's safer to do so and maybe more closer to your data. And maybe like in terms of terminology, maybe closer to what Vivian Smith does with the relationship, the role of the state vis-a-vis market actors. You can even make it three-dimensional, the role of the state via market actors and civil society, and then maybe you come your own labels that are more descriptive rather than labels or names. And in that regard, also the question, did you look at countries that are really aid dependent, that adopt SAVA because they have to, because it comes with funding from the World Bank or Latin American, Inter-American Bank and others? This is a question. But it is really amazing, especially, you know, the conceptual framework you had. I think we will all draw from it and learn from it and hopefully adapt it to our own studies and reference it. So it's pretty amazing.
Thank you for your comment and your question, Gita. Bob Lingård.
Bob Lingard, Australian Catholic University and the University of Queensland. I was just interested that your construction of context dealt with nations, albeit groups of nations, and I wondered, particularly in relation to the European ones, the impact of the EU, or indeed all of them, more broadly, the impact of the global. You know, taking the point that Patrick made yesterday about the denationalisation of the state and so on, where do those factors fit in? And another point I thought of in respect of that are the sort of topological relations now, where we have some schools and some nations reaching out to international organisations, bypassing subnational and national systems. I think there's a whole sets of relationships going on which play in and around the national. But it's a brilliant project, and I really learnt and enjoyed it very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you. And we have one question in the front row. Yeah. Then we take you afterwards.
Hi, I am Kanika. I am affiliated with Northwestern University in the US. You alluded to some heterogeneous effects from the regression analysis. I was wondering if some of the observations or other qualitative analysis could also explain some of the differences in and how you thought of context at the level of school.
Thank you very much. Should we take one more question and then you can provide some answers? Please, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Sue Winton from Toronto at York University. I had a question about your, just in the literature reviews, because I know Canada would probably be put with the Anglo-American, and I was curious about, and we don't necessarily see ourselves as, so I was curious in the lit review, or maybe we don't want to, we're just curious, like in the lit review, how, like sort of the breakdown in terms of countries, because I wasn't surprised to see that most of the literature comes from that categorization, but I was curious about within that categorization, so that was one question, and I guess this, part two was about capturing the variation within large countries. So like in Canada, like probably a lot of places, there's so much variation, but across. So I was just wondered about how you thought about that. Thanks.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Javier Campos. I'm from Chile, from the University Austral. I have two questions. Also, congratulations. This has been like a process that I have been able to follow since its beginning, and it's really nice to see like how it's ending, and I hope it continues in some sort of way. My two questions, one of them is if in your review you found any like success story of SAWA reforms, like empirically based accounts of places in which these reforms has really worked to improve the systems, and if not, if that is something that you find meaningful to also present in your results and to build something around that, because there is a bunch of people who really try to justify the use of this based on the success, but I haven't been able to find any evidence of it. And my second question is regarding the alignment between teacher education and SAWA reforms. And this came to my mind thinking in the case of Chile, and also in the case of the US. In the US, we have the education TPA that really move, and the Common Core that also move a lot of the teacher education towards this SAWA type of reforms. And now in Chile we have all the accreditation process, and we have testing to enter and to exit, and I'm feeling like the teacher education is becoming a lot like the school education. But also in regarding this alignment, in my hypothesis is that some teachers that came from a school that, the teacher education schools that started to follow these principles in their education of teachers are better suited to kind of like align with the SAWA reforms, or like do something with them in some different way than others. Maybe if you see difference or sort of answer could be the age of the teachers and the type of response they gave to this type of measures. So those are my two questions.
Thank you very much.
Okay, there's a question online from Rafan Daliri, and it's: did you get a sense or find that the practicing teachers in your research were critically aware of the broader policy conditions, and context of their work? And if not, is this problematic and why?
Thank you, Nuria. So, Tony, where do you want to start? Yes, I think we have two here and then yeah.
Well, thank you for all your comments and questions. They are very useful because we are still working on some products and they will help us to see how to frame them. Very quickly on the case of Sweden, you are absolutely right. The Swedish model of... Okay, then I will go...
You come here,
yes.
Tony.
Yeah, I was talking about the Swedish model that is an exception in the Nordic context, and it's true that sometimes these categories doesn't allow to capture this complexity. But yeah, since the 90s with the voucher system, it has been really becoming closer to the market model. And in our sample of countries, we have Norway that I think that fits much better with our imaginary of the Nordic education model. But thank you for your point, because you are absolutely right, and it's true that when we try to work with typologies, we have these limitations. But we think that is important also to talk about these typologies to overcome the methodological nationalism that sometimes we see, especially in comparative education and in comparative policy analysis. Another limitation of working with secondary data, that is the work we are doing, for instance, on convergence analysis, using the PISA OECD data, is that we only have countries that participate in the PISA test. And this means that many southern countries or Muslim countries, as Gita was mentioning, have left out. This doesn't mean that they are not relevant countries, and probably the mechanisms of instrumentation are also different. Actually, this is a work that probably Clara Fondevila will be doing in the next years, because she has been awarded with a British Academy Award precisely to look at how national assessments are spreading in the global south. So maybe Clara wants to say something about it after me. And yeah, Bob's comment, as usual, is very important. As I said, we don't see administrative regimes or these different models as static. And actually, one of the analytical challenges is to actually capture how precisely these new governance instruments have a performative effect and have the capacity through constant implementation to change the regulatory model. And this is something that, of course, we also see in some contexts, but we wanted to highlight a point that there are some contexts that are really structurally spelling some of the applications of these instruments, or making them less relevant in the everyday life of schools, or generating some forms of hidden resistance that in the end formal adoption doesn't mean that there is a real implementation. Maybe Marcel can give you some examples, Javier, on whether in some contexts we see SAGA working better or not. Our point is, yesterday there was an interesting question by Alejandra to Patrick on whether these instruments are inherently dangerous or generating undesired effects. What we want to show is that to respond to this answer, we need to look at these contingencies. So it's not the same, as I say before, a ranking or a particular type of incentive in a context where you have teachers more in control of the educational process than in a context where there is much more market pressure and teachers need to be constantly responding to these external demands. So our question is not whether these policies work or not, but under what conditions they generate what particular type of outcomes. And as a way to reflect on this variation. And you have also an important point on the age of teachers when it comes to see whether they are disposed to enact these policies more accordingly to the policy expectations. And this is something that our survey data somehow corroborates, and this goes in line with the work of Jessica Holloway, that really shows how the more teachers are socialized with these tools and instruments, the more they consent this new form of a school governance and an understanding of a school improvement. So the answer would be that yes. And shall we follow the same order?
Okay. Yes, in relation to the non-European or non-OECD countries, many thanks, Gita, for the comment and the question, because I think it's crucial. And in fact, when you review the literature on administrative regimes, institutional legacies, either they overlook the rest of the world, or we keep using these labels like African regimes, Arab administrative tradition, which I have some qualms about using. I mean, I don't think they are an administrative regime, Arab countries, or we need to understand why, besides being Arab, what do they have in common? So I think it's crucial in the case of Africa. There is sometimes a distinction between, okay, the Francophone countries with a French legacy, the Lusophone legacy, and so on, but it's not, I mean, there's a lot of work to do. And I think that we have not done this analysis because we are not familiar enough with these countries, and even if the literature have some consideration for non-OECD countries, including African countries, Latin American countries, and the Eastern Europe, we were not very convinced, I would say, by the categorizations, or we were not sure we were understanding them, and this is why we left these groups of countries aside, because we were less familiar with them. But I think that, yeah, certainly it's crucial. And also in relation to, okay, to what extent are we also witnessing some form of imposition, especially in the Global South when it comes to the SAWA policies? I think it will be, yeah, something curious to follow over the years to come, because imposition as such, I have not seen a lot of it, but maybe I have missed it. But it's true that through another kind of demands, it is being imposed in a way, especially on the need to report on a lot of performance, student performance data. Many countries are nudged or encouraged to establish some form of national assessments or participating in international assessments. And curiously, the same kind of encouragement has not been given in relation to the creation of other administrative data. So it's curious that in African countries, some of them have not received, let's say, enough resources to conduct a regular school census, but they receive the resources to conduct national assessments. So in a way, yes, I think that the SAWA agenda, it's very, African countries are really encouraged to pursue this agenda in something that is not imposition, but that sometimes borders imposition.
Okay, I will be very brief, and I will address the question about success stories and the role of international actors, European Union or other international organizations. Regarding the issue of the success stories, I would say, following Tony's point, that more than success stories, we should think about under what circumstances, under what context some policies generate particular results, and thinking about particular results more aligned to what now it's called this idea of the intelligent accountabilities, would be something similar to some cases of the Nordic model. Some cases definitely excluding maybe Sweden, but I'm thinking about Norway, and particularly thinking on the central role of trust in the accountability model of the Nordic countries, although there are also important elements that generate side effects, such as reputational effects. Marjolaine Confusion, Guri Sketsmo can say more about that, but I would say that if we can think about model that is more aligned to a positive outcome would be maybe this kind of countries that deal or achieve to attenuate the most negative side effects of performance-based accountability, especially those related to equity and basically due to the collegial approach of teacher autonomy and the element of trust in teachers that predominates in this model. Then regarding the European Union and the role of international actors, I would say, for example, that in the case of Napoleonic administrative traditions, we have adopted formally or more ceremonially some of the ideas of test-based accountability or new public management ideas for the influence of these international actors, although it seems that the school actors don't believe in this kind of model. So this is a kind of adoption maybe we could label as kind of fake adoption, or so there is an influence, but in the formal level, so should be investigated more in depth in what sense this formal adoption is generating impacts in the school level, and then to what extent the international influence of the European Union is taking place in the school level besides the regulatory changes in the Educational Reforms Acts. I would say this is all on my side.
Yes, about the age and the alignment with the PBA requirements, yeah, it would be a very interesting hypothesis to test. We just saw that there is no clear correlation between age, experience, and the PBA disposition, and that seems that is the context that influenced the most in that alignment. The context and how the school actors interpret the PBA requirements. About the coefficients, if I understood well, you were asking whether we control by all the unobserved factors, or I'm sorry. Yeah, not but in the models. In the results that we showed, there is no information from the observational.
You were drawing like there were heterogeneous effects depending upon the school type, right? And so I was wondering if there is data from the qualitative aspects of the study that can explain some of those heterogeneous effects, like beyond the regression coefficients.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. Through the qualitative stage, we have gone in depth in the possible mechanism that explains the coefficients. Yes, and that's why I was telling that we had also regression coefficients, heterogeneous regression coefficients according to composition and student performance of the school that was then in the qualitative stage confirmed. And we found out that dispositions to PBA and pressure can explain multiple types of school responses. Yeah. I don't know if you want to add something. No.
So I think all the questions and comments, they were about context, the matter of context. And I think the challenge that you've had in this project, you know, making sense of something very complex and try to present it in a simple way. This is the most challenging task that we as researchers do. And I look forward to continuing discussing the typologies, also the training model for the Nordic countries, in the coffee break. So a big applause to the panelists. Thank you very much.